It was the full-sized plastic jack-o'-lantern ashtray that finally pushed him over the edge, from furious resentment into deranged hatred. Most definitely the bright orange straw that broke the camel's miserable back. The decoration was certainly grotesque, but in none of the right ways. Instead of an actual pumpkin sitting as a proud example of homegrown ingenuity, and the clever personal touch of a leering glare designed by a knife carving its way into soft gourd, it was ugly because it was a cheap, bought-by-the-dozen trinket that beamed merrily, happy to be a receptacle of second-hand filth. There was no threat behind it, only a lifeless falsehood. Halloween was not supposed to be polite and wholesome. It was supposed to twist your insides into tight, uncomfortable knots and give you a peek into Pandora's box, reminding you exactly how close the precipice was between the relative normality of the turf we pitch our tents on and the chaos of a yawning chasm mere feet away. Although he hadn't initially planned to, he resolved to do it. He was going to kill these people tonight, and he was going to make it last. He was going to make them amazed at the amount of blood they had available to shed, and they were going to curse every drop as it ran down their veins. He extinguished his cigarette with a jet black filter on the porch railing and dropped it in the potted plant next to the friendly decorative ornament. Not a hint of malice was detectable in his gray eyes as he calmly walked down the steps towards his car. He had already decided what instrument he was going to use to kill them. Subtlety and sanitation be damned. This time, he was going to make a statement. Iris waved playfully back to their hostess as she opened the passenger seat of the crimson Honda CR-V. Nosebleed Red, her father nicknamed it, when she had first visited them with her husband Lucas.
Thanks for having us, Rita. Now get back up to the house, you'll freeze your tits off.
She climbed inside and slammed the door, but rolled down the window to conclude her parting words.
We had a great time. I'll see you Monday at spin class if you're not still hungover. Love you like hot fudge. Happy Halloween.
Rolling up the window, she made an enraged, distraught noise and punched the dashboard in front of her.
Ugh, I fucking hate that salacious, cock-bloated harlot,
she exclaimed venomously.
I tried to get us out the door sooner,
Lucas reminded her placidly, as he turned the high beams on and drove out onto the heavily forested back road.
And I tried listening, but you know we couldn't leave until I was sure.
It's nearly 2 a.m. Had you waited much longer, we would have been obligated to stay. That would have ruined everything.
No way. I would have faked a heart attack before having to spend the night under the same roof as that 24-carat whore. Or ended up shoving her down the stairs. Either way, a medevac chopper would have been involved.
I would have never guessed you two were rivals in high school.
Invite me over once a year just to flaunt her new Persian carpets and granite countertops. Yeah, I know her endgame. She's humping her banister right now, eyes rolling back, reliving every moment she's made me fake being impressed. Who the fuck even needs 3 chandeliers in their dining room, for Christ's sakes?
Someone with another 2 in their entryway.
Yet she chooses to celebrate the occasion by decorating her place with the tackiest bargain bin shit she could find. I think I'll strangle her with piano wire at our next spin class. But not just any piano wire. A golden one from the Shah of Iran's private bathroom or something.
When you're done ranting, I'm ready to hear your feedback.
Iris pulled a Ruger semi-automatic pistol from the glove compartment and checked to make sure it was loaded.
The safe is in the floor of the pantry. Took me a while to find it, but no way she'd hide it under the new Persian rug in the office. Drive another few minutes and park in the shrubs. Not the commuter lot. They have cameras there.
Lucas obliged her, and when the CR-V had navigated itself into a hidden spot amongst the New England foliage, he put on the emergency brake and pulled out his Jericho handgun from under the seat.
How many guests were left?
Barely any. 4 or 5. They'll be trickling out now. She and Clive will likely be in a vodka-induced coma in 20 minutes. They won't hear a thing.
You sure you remember the layout of the ground floor?
Like a kid knows the back of a cereal box. You have the alarm codes?
Grant rewired this place personally last week. He gave me both the AM and PM codes, and I gave him my season's pass.
We'll have enough bank to watch every game in the owner's box after tonight.
You're sure they won't trace this back to us?
You really think they'd report the burglary to the cops and admit they've been scamming the IRS for years? You know how reckless it is to keep that many bearer bonds in one place? Or how illegal it is to buy blood diamonds off the black market?
I'm not worried about the brass. I was more concerned about Clive's friends in New York.
Would you tell your kid his cancer was spreading?
Fair point. No hurting the dog.
The couple exited the vehicle and pulled their medieval executioner-style masks over their heads. Iris kicked off her pumps and replaced them with padded slippers with leather soles. Both quickly changed out of their party outfits and into black jackets and jeans, long since stripped away from any manufacturer's labels or distinguishing characteristics. Iris picked up the duffel bag and flashlight as Lucas disabled the GPS system and then locked the car.
Remember, if they wake up, no verbal communication between us. Just bag 'em, zip tie 'em, and we make for the reservoir.
I can't promise I won't rough her up with a fire poker first.
Your first husband was afraid of making spiders angry, but still chose to marry someone with your temper?
Sometimes, I suspect he just crawled into that casket to hide from me.
The two of them slipped as silent as the mist into the icy night's black shroud. Upon reaching the circuit board behind the pool house, where Lucas could test the delay in the alarm system's rebooting speed, Iris returned to her position at the opposite corner of the building after doing a perimeter check.
The last guests are gone. Music is off. Kitchen lights are out. Dog is in the garage. I see one light on in the upstairs master bathroom. I'd say give it another 10 minutes.
The pale light of Lucas's tablet screen glinted off her pistol as she held it pointing up with both hands.
All right, Nikita, lower that cannon. This isn't a movie, and you aren't a French assassin. You only raise the gun when you're planning on using it.
Fuck you. I didn't spend all that time practicing on the gun range to not develop a relationship with my piece.
The NRA called. They want you to do a commercial.
Shut up.
Her tone was suddenly less irritated and more cautious.
Do you hear that?
Lucas paused. From the far end of the house came a dull, scraping sound of metal against pavement. It was loud enough to cut through the stillness of the night air and draw blood from deep up inside the inner ear. Lucas quickly set the tablet aside.
That's coming from the front of the house. Is one of the other guests coming back?
Let's check.
The couple moved around the pool house in different directions and met by the back gate, both keeping low and remaining light-footed. When they both reached the gazebo, they took positions on the far side and watched the entryway where the footpath met the driveway. Through the shadows, they can make out the silhouette of a tall figure moving very slowly, almost comically so, as it made its way up the driveway. Whoever it was, they must have been dragging something heavy behind them, because the scraping sound corresponded with its position as it moved. The two observers remained silent for several seconds, until the stranger walked underneath the motion sensor light. When the electronic security beam activated and illuminated the approaching threat, the two of them felt their blood freeze for a second in fear before a sensation of confused irritation overpowered their discomfort. Marching up the driveway was a hunched figure in a black robe, its head down and face hidden. Over its shoulder rested a lumberjack's double-bladed axe, whereas in the figure's other hand, what could have been the axe's identical twin was deliberately being dragged behind him in a cumbersome fashion, as if to imply the weight was too much, and he was forced to drag it behind him like a ball and chain fastened to his ankle.
The fuck? Who's this clown? He'll ruin everything.
It has to be a Halloween prank. One of the other guests must be trying to scare them. He's not making any attempt to avoid the lights or stay hidden, and he's clearly hoping to get their attention by making noise dragging that axe.
Joke or not, if they get freaked out enough to call the cops, there goes our opportunity for early retirement.
Well, I'm not about going to ask him politely to put the axes down and leave so we can rob the place. You want to try?
Are you senile? There are probably other idiots in the woods nearby watching, possibly even recording everything. We can't risk being seen. Besides, what if it's not a joke and this is some short-sighted psycho with a grudge?
It's most definitely a joke.
The axes seem real.
So is your Ruger.
As the two continued to whisper back and forth, the figure had reached the top of the porch stairs. He walked a few paces over to the front door and very slowly leaned one of his axes against the doorframe. He then raised his fist up and slowly knocked softly. The way the figure was behaving convinced Lucas that the whole thing had to be some kind of performance. The actions were way too exaggerated and precise, giving him the impression that everything had been carefully rehearsed. He was clearly acting for the amusement of onlookers. Lucas sighed and scanned the surrounding trees, looking for any sign of the cloaked trespassers' audience. But he didn't detect a thing. He pondered the best way for them to proceed before the stranger was discovered by the homeowners. After half a minute without a response, the figure knocked again. Without a hint of impatience or urgency, there came no sound of barking from the garage, which even more so suggested that the figure was a returning guest that the dog already recognized.
Let's wait until this guy gets a response from inside. When everyone is distracted, we'll slip back behind the pool house. Hopefully there will be some forced laughter and a hasty invitation to fuck off. Then we can wait 30 minutes and start again.
And if he glances our way first?
We offer to split the loot.
You're not funny. Your attempt at drunken foreplay is, but you're not.
Both of them fell silent as the figure stood unmoving on the front porch by the doorway. What felt like a full minute passed without anything happening before the motion sensor light went out, and once again, the front yard was retaken by the hungry shadows.
What the fuck is he doing? Is he going to stand there all night?
Lucas was about to respond when the light suddenly blazed back to life, and he had to bite his lip to prevent from crying out in shock. He saw the axe raised for a half a second before it was brought down with a tremendous crash upon the front door. The dog immediately began barking, and more lights began appearing in the upstairs windows as the figure swung again and impaled the door with a heavy blade for a second time. Iris pulled her gun free and pointed it at the figure as it raised both axes, one in either hand, gripping the wooden handles just beneath the blades, and began hacking at the front door with both weapons, as if he was beating a drum.
We've got to go.
I'm sorry, I thought this was all definitely a joke.
I'm serious. The cops will be here within the next 10 minutes. If they find our car, the entire thing will be pinned on us. Who would believe we had nothing to do with this?
Fuck, I want it in that safe.
One of the axes embedded itself in the door so deep the figure was unable to pull it back out. The rhythm of its pounding had been broken. Despite Iris trying to keep her voice down, she unconsciously raised her volume enough to be heard above the pounding. And when the barrage on the door was interrupted by Iris's bark of anger carried across the short distance to the porch, it was enough to catch the attention of the phantom axe wielder.
Shit.
Lucas and Iris both stood up and raised their pistols in front of them, slowly backing away as the figure left the porch and almost seemed to glide towards them, clutching the axe handle in both hands. As the figure came beneath the moonlight, they saw that the intruder was donning a Grim Reaper mask.
Paper covers rock, fuckstick.
Iris hissed as she trained the barrel on the figure's head.
We're leaving. Take another step and...
She paused as she heard footsteps coming up swiftly out of the woods behind her. Lucas glanced behind them.
You're fucking kidding me.
Iris kept her gun trained on the first figure as she turned to look behind her. There was another cloaked figure, this time wearing a goat's head mask. Its overlarge horns were scraping the lower hanging branches above it as it stood only a few short feet away, holding the biggest, rustiest pitchfork she had ever seen.
You still got him?
Lucas asked her, referring to the first threat, as he already trained his weapon on the new one.
Fucking A. Alright guys, we're just going to exit stage left. You two do your thing.
Guns aren't allowed, came a muffled voice from under the goat mask. Suddenly, the Grim Reaper figure pulled out a small hatchet from under his cloak and hurled it at the goat man. Its blade connected somewhere under his chin, and with a soft, wet crunch, the figure crumbled. Reacting in sheer panic, Iris fired her gun and blew a hole right through the Reaper.
Fuck! Run!
Iris and Lucas ripped off their masks and sprinted towards the trees. They had barely made it 10 feet into the shadows when the dog barreled into Lucas and bit down on his leg.
Shit!
He brought the handle of the gun down on the animal's head twice, but it refused to release him. Iris raised her gun again, intending to shoot the animal on one of its back legs, but a whizzing sound directly next to her ear made her flinch, and she spun as she heard the sound of something connecting with the trunk of the nearest tree. It was an arrow.
Get down!
She cried out, but another arrow embedded itself into the meat of her side, and she felt her rib crack. She fell onto her knees as Lucas fired his gun right next to the dog's head. It yelped and detached itself from him and darted away in a sudden disoriented terror. Lucas fired his weapon 4 more times into the woods in the direction of where the arrow had come from. Iris reached out towards him.
I'm fine. Let's go.
Another figure carrying a sledgehammer emerged from the trees. She couldn't make out what kind of mask it was wearing. It was too dark. But she saw the figure raise its own weapon high over its head to bring it down on Lucas. Iris raised her Ruger with one hand and fired several random shots in the figure's direction. By the brief flashes made by her shots, she could see that the figure was wearing some kind of sad clown mask. She ran out of ammo as the circus freak fell onto one knee, gasping for air, and then fell backwards entirely as an arrow speared him in the face. Iris turned to see a shorter figure in a plague doctor's mask, standing over Lucas with a crossbow. Instead of reloading, it bent down and picked up Lucas's handgun.
Get out of here!
Lucas cried out as the butt of the crossbow slammed into his face. Iris staggered into the trees, expecting to hear gunfire behind her, but none came. After a few minutes of crawling through the forest in relative silence, she paused, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and her heart hammering as blood leaked down her side. She attempted to pull the arrow from her, but the pain was too intense.
Last I fucking remembered, Valentine's Day was the one with the massacre.
She wasn't going to make it to the CRV. Circling back around to the yard, every step causing her agony, she paused as she heard screams coming from inside the house. She knelt down on the leaves, parted the branches, and watched as the plague doctor left the house through the garage. The homeowners Rita and Clive must have opened it to let the dog out. The plague doctor lifted a can of gasoline and poured it all over the motionless bodies of the Grim Reaper and the Goat Man that had been dragged into the driveway. One of them moaned as the plague doctor lit a match and ignited them. There was no sign of Lucas anywhere. What the fuck was going on? Where were the cops? Why hadn't the alarm gone off? And who were these fucking people running around killing each other in the dead of night? The plague doctor reloaded the weapon and pulled a flare gun from under its coat and fired 3 scarlet shots into the air. Then the figure turned and made for the woods in the direction of the pool house. Iris lay motionless for several minutes acutely aware of how heavy her eyes were becoming and how cold she was getting, most likely due to the blood loss. She had to risk a dash towards the house. She could lock herself in the pantry and phone for help. From somewhere in the darkness off to the left came a cracking sound, like a splintering branch. A woman's voice screamed in ferocious agony. She caught a glimpse of a dog limping out of the woods and hiding under the front porch. It laid still and didn't make a sound. It had the right idea. Iris forced herself up by leaning against a nearby tree for support.
Okay. Fuck dying out here alone. Let's do this.
She made to step out of the foliage when she heard a voice whisper from a few feet behind her in a kind of sing-along giggle.
Now then, who are you?
She bolted towards the front door, the pain in her side momentarily forgotten as terror overcame her injury. Shoving her way past the parked cars and through the doorway into the laundry room, she tripped and went sprawling over a shoe rack and hit the ground, snapping the arrow shaft beneath her. The pain was like being impaled on a red-hot spike, and she nearly passed out as she screamed loud enough to rattle those overhead obtrusive chandeliers. She heard the pounding of heavy feet coming from somewhere on the floor above her, but before she could even pause to consider who it might have been, her vision swam, and all went dark. Iris awoke with her hands bound and her wound bandaged. She was propped up on the ornate love seat in the front room, the only light coming from the blaze contained within the fireplace. She sat up groggily.
The fuck kind of party is this?
Turning her head, she froze as she noticed the two severed heads resting on the dining room table across the room like they were unwanted appetizers, Rita and Clive. She staggered to her feet and nearly fell forward as she discovered that her right ankle was cuffed to the wine cabinet. She rolled her eyes.
On any other night, that may seem convenient.
Out in the driveway, she could make out what appeared to be 4 separate bodies burning, and the air reeked of gasoline fumes. There came a steady rhythmic thudding of something heavy being dragged down the stairs, and she turned to see the plague doctor hauling another body into the entryway. The figure seemed to feel her eyes on it as it turned and glanced her way. Abandoning the body, it came forward and stood in front of her, glancing back and forth between herself and the heads on the table. If she didn't know any better, she would say that the plague doctor was confused.
Who killed those two?
An annoyed voice came from behind the mask before there was a flash of a knife and the doctor's head was wrenched back as their throat was slashed. As the figure fell, Lucas dropped the knife and leaned against the doorframe, his pant legs soaked with blood from the dog bites.
Babe! Thank Christ! Get me out of this thing!
You know where the key is?
He groaned as he slid down the frame and rested his head against the wall.
No idea. Hurry up and find it.
She paused for a moment as she noticed their duffel bag resting on the cabinet behind him. She thought that she had dropped it by the gazebo.
Did you get into the safe?
He nodded in exhausted confirmation.
How did you figure out the code without me?
He motioned towards the 2 severed heads.
They told me.
He pulled a pack of smokes from his back pocket and painfully raised a cigarette with a jet black filter to his lips.
Right before I killed them.
She stared at him in stunned, mortified disbelief.
The fuck did you just say?
He exhaled 2 pillars of gray smoke from his nose.
The ashtray made me do it. I fucking hate lazy, disingenuous people. Your first husband was the same way.
Iris's jaw dropped.
He's overdosed.
She insisted, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucas shrugged.
Technically, that's true, but not due to carelessness.
You rancid fucking shit.
For people like me, Halloween is the only joy we have left. A night where all pretenses can be set aside, and we can finally enjoy our favorite music. The screaming, pure, hopeless, desperate wails of pure terror makes my heart soar.
So all these psychos were with you?
Unfortunately not. Bittersweet coincidence. The October Slayers are cultists, seriously devout. They believe to kill or be killed during the ritual on Halloween night will elevate them in the afterlife. Make them gods or something. Sounds badass. Turns out Clive was one of them.
Why bittersweet?
Sweet, because the robbery and all the deaths will all be pinned on them. Bitter, because it forces my hand regarding us. Sorry, this was never going to last. We both knew that.
He stood up and tossed his cigarette aside.
These fanatics have a saying. To die amongst the dying will make you immortal. To die alone is to doom you never to reach the other side.
He picked up the knife that he had dropped and limped towards her.
Going to be a bitch to reach the car on this leg, but I'll manage. Not sure who exactly chained you up or why, but it made my monologuing easier.
Babe,
He paused and looked down at her.
you're hung like a field mouse.
She raised the crossbow the plague doctor had collapsed on top of, as Lucas dove forward at her with the knife. The papers reported only one survivor had been removed from the house the following morning, a guest from the party the night before. Their injuries were severe, but that individual had been the lucky one. A total of 16 bodies had been discovered across the property, most burned beyond recognition. During the search, the investigators failed to discover the floor safe in the pantry, where the duffel bag had been stuffed back into. The survivor failed to mention the safe during the interview, and only muttered a few words upon waking up.
I fucking hate Halloween.